Hello, everybody, and welcome to Gateways number 7. This is another new episode of the podcast, and today we're going to be kind of continuing where we left off yesterday in terms of talking about chord progressions. Now, last time I know that I talked a lot about how I developed a chord progression and the different ways you can develop a chord progression. Today we're going to be going into a few more examples. So yeah, let's just jump right into it. These examples are going to be some of my older pieces that I wrote. I hope you enjoy them. I hope you can learn something from them, because, these were pieces I wrote when I had less experience. And now that I have a little bit more, I can create pieces that are a little more, harmonically interesting and whatnot. So, to start off, I have a piece that I wrote which has several names. One of the names is Method Acting, and the whole point of this piece was it was just a piece that I wanted to write for fun. It was a piece that was just supposed to be fun. That was the whole point of it, and I thought it was really interesting, and you can hear it right now. Now, that was a piece that I wrote in about a day. That was how long it took of writing. I remember that day, the reason why I wrote it was because I actually wasn't feeling that well, so I wanted to write something that was a little more, it felt better than I did at that moment, which is kind of where its inspiration came from. And now, in talking about chord progressions, I have, the chord progression on hand, of course, because I wrote the piece. And it's currently playing in the background right now. And, like I said, I wasn't feeling that well, so that's where that's why that dissonance is kind of present in that harmony, because I wanted to kind of tell that story that I wasn't feeling well, but I wanted to express that I hope to feel better, which is where the melodic line comes from. And it's repetition throughout the piece. And then that entire idea came from an introduction that I originally developed, which sounded like this. And, it had some odd rhythm in it, and the whole point of the odd rhythm was to, again, kind of give that feeling of uneasiness, because you don't expect it. It's like cold. So that's kind of where that whole idea came from. And what I actually did for those chords was I borrowed a chord progression. Now, this was written a few months back, so I couldn't tell you exactly what that chord progression was, but that kind of brings me to my first point when it comes to creating a chord progression. Is, if we're being honest, every single combination in 12-tone equal temperament of chords has been used before. Now, what do I mean by that? It basically means like every single combination of chords has already exists. So if you really like a certain harmonic idea, you can reuse it. In the great words of Stravinsky, lesser artists borrow and great artists steal. Now, what does that mean? I know that everyone's been told that plagiarism is like the cardinal error you can commit in anything at all. You're never allowed to steal anyone else's work. Now, that's true, unless you credit them, of course. But in music, it's very different because you have situations like the theme of Paganini, Rachmaninoff's Rhapsody on the theme of Paganini. It's an entire piece based on a theme written by Paganini, who is a virtuoso violinist player. And it's just 26 variations of that theme. So we essentially created an entire piece using only that melodic line and variations of it. You also have things like there's an artist by the name of Plunderphonics. The way that he worked, he was one of the people who led into the modern day synthwave genre, in that he decided that a sampler should be an instrument. So what he did was he took a song written by Michael Jackson and adjusted its speed at certain points, and he said that technically this is a new work, and that's true, it was a new work. Now, did that stop Michael Jackson from demanding that the Canadian police burn every copy of Plunderphonics within the country? No, because the modern day musical system and just copyright and trademark system in general is completely flawed in virtually every way, because it's very easy to exploit and it's very easy to get exploited. But that's besides the point. If you want to borrow a chord progression from something because you think it sounds like really interesting and you want to see how it'll interact with the melodic line that you've written, then go ahead and do that. Try it out, see what happens. And you can adjust it, you can change it to what you think you want it to sound like. That doesn't mean that you can't, reuse common orders of chords. Like, one of the most common jazz progressions is the minor 2 to 5 to 1. Now, why is that? Well, one, it sounds really pleasant, especially when you have the tensions on there that we talked about before. And also, 2 to 5 is up a perfect fourth, and 5 to 1 is down a perfect fifth. So it resolves really nicely. Now, you also have things like you can use methods of tritone substitution, where you take the... It's very interesting. It's like, how can I explain this in a way that's easy to understand? It's kind of like you understand it based more on application than kind of speech. But it's kind of like you substitute a dominant 7th chord with another that is 3 whole steps from the original. So it's like, let's say you have you're in C major and you have G7. Well, now you're playing D flat 7, which is its tritone. And the reason why you do that is because you have the traditional 5 to 1 resolution. What you can also do is instead do the tritone substitution of that 5, which is the flat 2, which then you resolve that to the 1. In this case, it would be a C7. And the chromatic resolution is really interesting and is very colorful. But these are all things that have been done before. Technically, if you really think about it, chords can only be arranged in a certain way when you're using 12-tone equal temperament. There's only a set number of ways they can be done. In fact, 2 lawyers actually did that with melodic lines, not even just chord structures. With melodies, they have technically copyrighted I think there's about 6 billion different possible melodic lines, like rhythmically and note-wise. And then they basically said, like, Creative Commons, anyone and everyone is allowed to use them. And this happened directly after the suing of... It wasn't the Ed Sheeran case. It was the case where a rap artist by the name of Flame, I believe, accused Katy Perry's Dark Horse of stealing his melodic line, even though in reality they were not at all similar, and it was only just like an abuse of copyright law that allowed him to win. If you want to hear more about that, Adam Neely did a good commentary on it. You should go watch him. But, you know, you don't have to like be ashamed if you borrow a chord progression from somewhere, because that's just, you know, a part of making music. Now, you know, this kind of brings me on to another example song, which borrows a chord progression from a pretty famous jazz song, actually. Now, you know, you'll be able to hear it right about now, I believe. And with this particular song, it's a standard blues progression. And with, you know, a standard blues progression, it's the one... Wait, no, this wasn't the blues progression. No. This was from a very different song. It was a very interesting song. I really liked it. Give me just a minute to remember the name. Because, you know, this is a song you should really have a listen to. Especially if, you know, you're into jazz music. Because, you know, jazz is awesome. Speaking of which, while I remember his name, I recommend you listen to The Black Saint and the Sinner Lady by Charles Mingus. Great album, about 30 minutes long. I really liked it. But I believe the song that I ended up deriving that chord progression from was a tune called, I think it was Blue Monk. Yeah, it was Blue Monk. You should listen to Blue Monk to understand where that chord progression came from that you just heard in the background. So, you know, that's another example of you can just borrow chord progressions from various sources. You know, another way you can do it is you can do it by ear, which in my piece last time, that one was done by ear. That was just based on the emotion that I wanted to create. Another one would be, you know, a piece that I have that I called Commerce. Don't ask why, it was just the name that came into my head at the time. But with Commerce, it was like a short jazz piece where I tried to have the trumpet and saxophone play off of one another. And, you know, you hear those chords in the background. I believe that one was tritone substitution, definitely. And, you know, that was fun to do, and that was entirely by ear. I added the tritone substitution afterwards because, you know, I knew that I knew it would sound nice, just because of, like, the theory that I ended up picking up in doing all of this musical work. Now, this piece was actually written before the first example, which is why it's so short. That was actually the first piece that I wrote in my IBDP music class. And, you know, so you can do a lot of stuff by ear, really, if you just trust your instincts and trust your ear, because it's up to you to decide how exactly you want your music to sound and what harmonic environment you want to create. There are some, like, super dissonant harmonic environments out there, and they're really interesting to listen to, just because, like, the feelings that it gives are incredible. And, you know, there's also, like, there's story-based chord progression, story-based arranging, where the goal of it is you have, like, your melodic line already set, and you're thinking, okay, you know, 1, what emotion am I going for? 2, what chord kind of emphasizes that emotion, and how do the relationships between these chords emphasize that emotion? And that's kind of a mixture between the by ear thing and like creating harmony in a theoretical sense, because you both have to kind of know how each of the chords interact with one another, so that you can have like that storytelling, and so that all the chords connect. But at the same time, you're doing it based on the emotion that you want to feel, so you're kind of determining, do I want to change this, theoretical concept to something different, because it doesn't have the same color that I'm looking for in my piece right now. So, that's kind of, and your whole goal is to tell a story, because storytelling is, one of the most basic ways of human communication throughout all of history, is telling stories. That's how we basically got history, was the telling of stories. So if you want to tell a story in your music, then you can't just base it off of like theory. You also have to throw in your own little elements into it to make the story truly yours. If you want to hear that style of arranging again, Adam Neely, great for that, did some interesting reharmonizations of pieces like Thank You Next and Hello by Adele, but they're both jazz fusion versions. They're really cool to listen to. And he did an entire video discussing how exactly he developed the chord progression and developed the story behind them. And the last kind of major way that you can develop a chord progression is doing it solely based on theory. Now I wouldn't recommend this because, as said by Herbie Hancock himself, music without heart isn't music. Now that's paraphrasing, of course. But it's like you could do a C sharp major with a sharp 11, but if there's no heart in it, then you're not really making music. So keeping that in mind, right? If you're going for a very theory-driven piece, one, it'll probably end up sounding like an instrumental study, which, if you don't know what that is essentially like an exercise piece to demonstrate technical skill. But two, if you're just going through pure theory, sure, it'll sound beautiful, but it won't have that emotion. But sometimes that's what you want. I know there's a type of music called 12-tone serialism, and the way that 12-tone serialism works is essentially you treat every note in the 12-tone equal temper system as equal, and you have to create what's called a tone row, and it creates some interesting harmonic development. If you want an example of that, listen to Stravinsky Septet Movement Number 2. You can also listen to, I believe it's a piece called Why Are We Here? It's when you listen to it, it's basically you have a single trumpet asking why are we here, and then in response you have 4 or 5 clarinets all playing very dissonant harmony to essentially answer the question of, why are we here? What is the purpose? And it's meant to represent, our constant contemplation on why we exist, which is another interesting piece you can look into if you want to hear that style of music. Now, I could definitely not explain to you all of harmonic theory. Why? Because harmonic theory, the pure theory, is incredibly complicated to wrap your head around. If you want to take that dive, there are a lot of books that I definitely recommend reading or listening to. First off, if you're a complete beginner, in the Drive, there's Berklee Harmony 1 and Harmony 2. That's a great place to start to try to gain a full understanding of harmony in 12-tone equal temperament. If you have some understanding, you can try to start reading 20th Century Harmony, which is a book I'm trying to read, and it's incredibly complex to understand, but it's still worthwhile if you want to get into more developed harmonic spaces. If you want to look more into expanding your horizons with different tuning systems, there's a large number of master classes and interviews done by Jacob Collier, which you can find on YouTube. very helpful because he goes into his process. He also does like explaining his live sessions of different songs. Like I know his most recent one was like he did a full live session of In My Bones. He's done a live session of his Grammy-winning a cappella version of the song Moon River. There's been several explanations by like people like David Bruce, composer, of his transition from G major to E. I believe it was E half. It was either E half sharp or E half flat. One or the other. He basically went from G major to E half flat. G half sharp major in a song called In the Bleak Midwinter. So you can go watch David Bruce, composer's video on that if you want to look into like how exactly he did it. I know that Adam Neely, as of today, released a piece discussing like, just intonation and the way that tuning systems work. So there are a lot of sources for looking into like different forms of music, and just looking into music theory in general. And if that's a dive that you want to take, then go ahead, because it can really add something to your music, especially if you know all of this theory and you can put your emotion behind what you want to make. And that's what there is to do. It's kind of like the four major things. You have basically borrowing. You have borrowing chord progressions. You have creating them by ear. You kind of like creating them via like a story in your mind, and then you have like pure theoretical, and then you have the epiphany, which is kind of doing all of them in one. And I'm gonna end off today's podcast here, but I just want to say, like as a little assignment, I want you to employ one of these methods and state which one you employed to write a chord progression. You don't need a melodic line, you don't need rhythm, you don't need anything else. Just a chord progression. And I want to hear, like, one, what you picked, and then the harmony itself, because then we can discuss it in the last section on harmony, which will be next week. We can discuss how the different forms influenced each of the people who made them. And then after this section on harmony is done, we're just gonna move on to rhythm. And yeah, that's that. So hope you have a pleasant morning, evening, afternoon, night, wherever you are in the world. And goodbye.